Hi, so in this video we're going to be looking at the Kush Blyss plugin. This is a saturation and EQ plugin that also has compression. It's one of a new generation of saturation plugins that reacts to my ears. I don't know what's going on under the hood, but it sounds like it's reacting in a very complex way to the audio material. And it has 6 stages of saturation within it that are all interacting with each other. So it's reacting like analog gear does in much more complex ways than previous generations of saturation plugins did. It sounds great. And the EQ sounds really good, and it's also interacting with the saturation and changing the saturation in complex ways when you move the EQ. And it's also got a compressor, which sounds great too. So we're going to be having a look at this, and before we do, if you can subscribe to the channel and like the video, that's really helpful to me and really appreciated, and I hope you find this useful. So let's have a look. So here we are with Blyss. So let's have a look at the interface. The heart of this is saturation, but it's also an EQ. We've got an input and an output. These are double dials, so you've got like an outside and an inside. And same thing here on the left, 2 dials. The inner one is the amount of saturation, and the outer one is the blend, which is like a dry wet, just for the saturation part, not for the whole thing. So the saturation on this is interesting. It's like some of the other new generation saturation plugins where the developers have looked at the way analog gear works. And you know, in analog gear you have one piece of gear that adds some saturation, and then that goes into another piece of gear. Even within the gear you've got more than one thing that causes saturation, and one part might drive another part, and then that whole piece of gear goes into another piece of gear which adds more saturation, and the first one drives the second one. The whole thing is like almost kind of like a living, breathing thing. Everything's kind of moving and affecting each other. Everything's working non-linearly. And so this is what some of the newer saturation devices are doing, and they're getting more and more sophisticated. So this is an example of that. You've got 6 stages of saturation. So you've got 3 emulations of transformers, an input stage, an interstage. I guess that means you know, a transformer after the input transformer, and then an output transformer. So each one is saturating in a different way, and they're all affecting each other. And then they go into, or I don't know whether they go into it first or whether these things are arranged in a certain order, I don't know. But then there's 3 discrete op-amp stages, which each also add saturation. So it's like a more complex analog chain. And I'm guessing from the sound of this that these things are reacting in very complex ways. So that they're reacting to the envelope, the amplitude envelope, the transient envelope, and the overall level and the frequency content of the signal going through it, and dynamically changing the way they saturate depending on all of that, like a piece of analog gear does. I don't know for sure that this is doing that. It sounds like it is to me. And I know some of the other newer saturation devices, plugins are doing that. And it's a big step forward, because a lot of the previous generation of saturation just kind of do a thing. You know, they just saturate, blanket saturation. And they're getting more and more sophisticated. And this one, I'm guessing, is doing a lot of complex stuff under the hood. And if you look at it in Plugin Doctor, the saturation is extremely complex. It's not just adding, you know, a few harmonics. It's like really complex, and that changes. You can't, in Plugin Doctor, or at least I don't know how to do it, see how the saturation pattern changes depending on input levels and frequency content. You can just see it as a static thing, but what you can see is when you change the amount of saturation, it isn't just moving up a set of harmonics louder, it's changing the whole pattern. And it's the same with all the EQs. Each of these EQ knobs changes it in a different way. So you've got a very complex thing going on here, and I'm guessing that there's a lot of nonlinear and dynamic interaction going on between all of these components, which I'm guessing is partly what gives it its really lush, rich sound. So, saturation. Now, going over to the EQ sections, we've got 4 EQ bands, which have selectable frequencies, as you can see here, and can be switched off and on. And the bells on these are really wide, but they're proportional, so as you boost more, it stays wide at the bottom, but it gets thinner at the top. So it's got a proportional Q, which is really helpful and useful, I think, for this kind of EQ. But for small boosts, you've got a really wide bell. So wide so that, like, if you have this at 40 hertz, you know, you're going to get something that's almost like a low shelf, not quite the same shape, but the left-hand side of it is below 20 hertz. So it's boosted all the way down as far as you can hear, and it ends up being a bit like a shelf. So yeah, you've got different frequency selections for each of these, and then you've got a mid here with a selection and a high frequency, and then you've got a low and a high pass here. Now this one is interesting, this high pass, because it really changes the shape of this low bell here a lot. It doesn't just seem to act like a low pass you'd expect it would, and it may be the bell that's unusual in shape, or it might be the high pass, I'm not sure. But if you look at it on Plugin Doctor, like, it really changes the whole shape of the thing quite a bit. So by playing with these, you can really shape the low end in some really useful and interesting ways. So that's an interesting aspect to it. Here you've got a meter with a green line and a red line. You can't see the green line at the moment, but the green line shows you the input, which you want to be around 0 dB. So you want to gain stage this properly by having some kind of gain plug-in before to get the louder points at 0 dB if you want to make the most out of this plug-in. And the output is the red line. And then this is the amount of saturation happening, this meter here. So the final section is the compressor. It's like a mastering style compressor, so it's very gentle and quite transparent. And it's got just a slow and fast timing, so it's a bit like an old style compressor in that you can't select those separately, but they give you some useful settings. And if I can remember what they are, on the fast it's 10 milliseconds attack, no, 3 milliseconds attack, and it's 80 to 200 milliseconds release because it's a program dependent release. And then when you go to the slow, it moves the attack to 10 milliseconds and 250 to 500 milliseconds release. So it's really useful ranges for this kind of compressor, this kind of mastering style compressor. And it's got a makeup, as you expect, and here you can switch the compressor out and just use the saturation if you want. It's got a bypass, and that's basically it. So now let's have a listen. I'm going to open up the drums that I've got this on. We're going to be listening to drums, and I've got it on kick, snare, and overheads. And what I'm going to do is play it without, and then I'm going to bring them all in at the same time so you can hear the difference of them being in and out. So start with them out, and then I'll bring them in. Okay, so hopefully you can get, I mean, there's quite a lot of EQ going on here, but hopefully you can get an idea about the tonal quality of this plugin. It has a real nice solidity and weight to the bottom end, and the top end is really smooth and creamy and silky. So hopefully that came across, but you're going to hear it in more detail now because I'm going to start looking at these one at a time. So we'll start with the kick drum. And what I'll do is play it soloed, and I'm going to bring this in and out and a few times, and then I'll start messing around with it so you can kind of see what you can do with it. So I'll start with it out and then I'll bring it in. So hopefully you can hear the weight and solidity that this is adding to it. Now there's a lot of EQ going on there, but it's worth keeping in mind that these EQs are the bells are very wide on them, as I mentioned. So even though it looked like there's quite a bit here, 4.5 dB, it's wide enough that it's not like going to sound the same as a tighter bell. At this boost anyway, it's wide enough. It gets thinner as you boost more. So the saturation is as much at play as you'll hear as the boost, and that's what I'm going to do now is to play it and start messing around with all the controls so you can get more of an idea of what this can do. Okay, so hopefully you get a bit of an idea of some of the things capable here. I'll have to excuse the gate on this kick is not working very well. I should have set it up better, but it's actually kind of catching the edge of it a little bit, which sounds like a bit of distortion, which isn't really distortion. It's just the gate not quite set right. But hopefully you could hear that when I cranked this distortion even all the way up, this saturation, it didn't break up like you'd expect. It got a little bit breaky up, but hardly at all. And when it was down here, like, you know, most of the way up, there was no obvious breakup, and it was just really rich and weighty. It adds a lot of nice solidity to the low end, especially when you're boosting it quite a bit. So quite a wide range of tonal effects you can get on the kick drum. So let's move over to the snare. And I'll bring this in and out, and then I'll mess around with it. So quite a nice snappy sound. Of course, it's EQ'd quite a bit. So, but what I like about this, one of the things I like about this Blyss is that even when you're EQing it quite a lot and putting a fair amount of saturation on it, it always seems to sound natural. It doesn't sound processed in the way that a lot of EQs and saturation will once you put more than a certain amount. And this one, even when you put a lot on, it still seems to sound natural and kind of organic sounding. I think that's one of its really strong points. So I'm going to mess around now and see what we can do with the snare. So a wide range of snare sounds, all sounding really natural, even though there's quite a lot going on here. And again, like with the kick, even all the way up with the saturation, it didn't break up in an unpleasing way. It stayed smooth and creamy and just thickened up the snare sound really nicely, and gives you a whole other range of texture. I really transformed the snare sound quite a bit just with the saturation. And yet it still sounded natural. And also I thought it was interesting to try, even though this is a mastering compressor, it's described as one, and it really is like one. It also works well as a channel compressor. I mean, I got a nice smack out of it by driving it hard with the snare, and also on fast it was pretty good at crushing the snare. So yeah, more versatile than I imagined it would be. Actually, it's very versatile, this compressor. So, and it sounds great. So yeah, really sounds great on snare. So let's have a look at the overheads. I'm going to listen to these in context because I think it'll make a lot more sense in context of the other drums. So let's have a listen with and without. I'll start without. So it wasn't perfectly level matched, but hopefully you could hear the smoothness and creaminess that this added to the cymbals. And I actually find it's very hard to find a saturation that does that well. I'm always looking for a saturation to do that if I need the cymbals to be smoothed off a bit. And it's really hard to find one that does it well. And this just does it beautifully. It's just, I mean, those cymbals don't even sound harsh without anything on them. But here we've got quite a boost of EQ. And this EQ here, you know, at 8, when it's set to 8K, it's a really wide bell. So it goes all the way down to like 2K and a little beyond 2K, you know, the slope. So you're boosting quite a bit in the upper mids as well, and yet still, you know, it's less harsh than without it in. It's even smoother and creamier. So yeah, really impressive. I'm not going to mess around with it because I think you get the idea of what you can do with this in terms of really beautiful, smooth, high end. So let's move on now to the bass. So I'm going to put this in context because I think it's going to be easier to hear what this does with the bass in context. So what I'll do is I'll start without it, and then I'll bring it in and out, and then I'll have a bit of a mess about. So hopefully you could hear what a beautiful thing this does to the texture of the bass. It gives it like this, to my ears, this velvety texture to the texture of the bass. It just sounds fantastic to me, really lush and velvety, and really brings out the tone of the bass in a really beautiful way. And again, I guess that's the complex saturation, even though I'm only adding not too much of it. You know, the meter is reading up there. As you can see, the meter is... It is adding a fair amount, and it's just really, yeah. But obviously I'm doing some EQ here as well. So now I'm going to mess around with this and see what we can do with that. So again, huge range of different tones you can get out of the bass, and even when I drove it really hard, it just really fattened it up, rather than it sounding like, you know, fuzz bass or anything like that. Just you get this richness that increases and increases, rather than it breaking up into fuzziness. Really nice, and the EQs just react really nicely with the distortion. As I mentioned, as you move these, it changes the distortion pattern. You can see it on Plugin Doctor. In quite complex ways. So yeah, really sounds great. Now we're going to finish off by looking at it on the 2-bus, and I'm going to bring it in and out so you can hear what it's like, and then I'm going to mess about a bit. So I'm going to use the bypass button down here because I think it's going to sound a bit smoother. So I'm going to start with it out and then bring it in. So you can hear when I bring it in, it just opens the whole thing out, front to back, side to side. The whole detail, everything improves, and it's fantastic. It sounds just fantastic, lush and spacious, and really nice. So what I'm going to do now is, just so you can hear the saturation on its own, I'm going to zero out the EQ and just bring it in and out with just the saturation, so you can just hear that. And I think I will take out the compressor as well. Fantastic. I mean, just the saturation on its own, you can hear it just opens the sound up when I click it in, and it just seems to close it in and close it down when I take it out. I mean, it's subtle, but it's really very clear to my ears what this is doing in terms of like opening up the sound, revealing more detail, to the point when I take it out and it just all sounds kind of closed in and closed off more. So fantastic. So let's now, I'm going to have a bit of a mess around with some of the EQs and other controls and the compressor, and see what we can do. I'm not going to be too extensive about this, but just to give you a bit of an idea. So yeah, I mean, I'm taking it further than I would just for demonstration purposes in terms of the EQ and things, but just and the saturation, but just to give you an idea of what this thing can do. It really does give it, you know, that really gave it a quite a you know, the low end got really punchy and solid, and the high end got really smooth and silky, and compressor working really nicely. Yeah, fantastic. So I hope you found this useful. If you did, please give the video a like and subscribe, and hope to see you next time.